The neon sign of the Golden Grill Diner didn't just flicker, it buzzed with a rhythmic, dying stutter that seemed to count down the seconds of a life Nancy couldn't escape. Inside, the diner was a symphony of clattering porcelain and aggressive steam, a place where the scent of burnt coffee and old grease hung in the air like a thick, oily veil. The linoleum floor was worn into gray paths by decades of weary feet, polished only by the spill of cheap soda and the tears of people who had nowhere else to go. This was a world of sticky menus, frantic demands, and tips left in copper pennies. It was a place where poverty was treated like a contagious disease, and speed was the only virtue that kept the manager from screaming. Nancy stood behind the counter of the third booth, her hands folded neatly over a small stack of crumpled dollar bills. She was in her early 20s, with eyes that held a calm, ancient kindness that most people in this neighborhood failed to notice because they were too busy looking at her uniform. Her dress was a classic black short sleeve, crisp and professional, but the hem was slightly frayed from 1,000 wash cycles. In a city where the waterfront elite wore silk blends that cost more than Nancy's brother's annual tuition, her clean but faded white apron was a silent confession of her outsider status. She wasn't part of the bustling city's upward climb. She was the invisible gear, the black woman who served the eggs, mopped the spills, and absorbed the vitriol of the morning rush without a word. She was a ghost in a white collar, a piece of the architecture that happened to breathe. "You're running behind on table 4, Walker. Stop daydreaming and move," a voice barked, sharp as a whip crack. It was Silas Vance, the manager and self-appointed tyrant of the grease trap. He was leaning against the pass-through window with a predatory impatience, his face flushed with the heat of the grill. His voice wasn't just loud, it was pitched perfectly to humiliate, cutting through the warm steam of the kitchen like a jagged blade. The door to the Golden Grill groaned on its hinges, letting in a swirl of city grit and the humid breath of the waterfront. A man stepped inside, moving with a quietness that seemed at odds with the frantic energy of the lunch rush. He wore a neutral gray button-up, the fabric clean but unpretentious, and took a seat at a corner table where the light struggled to reach. He didn't look like the usual dock workers with their loud bravado, or the harried commuters checking their watches. He sat upright, his hands resting calmly on the scarred wood, observing the room with a sharp, controlled stillness. Nancy approached him, her posture graceful despite the ache beginning to bloom in her lower back. She set down a glass of water and a menu with a gentle hand, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. She saw a face etched with a quiet authority, yet framed by a weariness that mirrored her own. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the surrounding noise. "I'll give you a moment with the menu." When she returned 10 minutes later, he ordered the simplest meal on the board, a bowl of beef stew and a cup of black tea. As he ate, Nancy noticed he wasn't eating like a man who was starving, but like a man who was tasting the very soul of the place. He watched Silas berate a busboy in the kitchen doorway. He watched a regular customer walk out without leaving a tip. He watched Nancy's tireless, silent movement between the booths. The tension broke when the check arrived. The man reached into a worn leather wallet and produced a card, handing it to Nancy with a polite nod. When she ran it through the aging terminal at the counter, the screen didn't flash green. It blinked a harsh, judgmental red. Declined. Nancy tried again, her heart sinking. Behind her, she felt Silas's shadow loom. The manager had been watching the gray-shirted stranger since he sat down, his suspicion already simmering. "What's the holdup, Walker?" Silas's voice cut through the air, loud enough to make the man at the corner table look up. "The card isn't going through, Silas. It's probably just the machine," Nancy said quickly, trying to shield the customer from the growing heat of Silas's gaze. "The machine is fine," Silas sneered, stepping around the counter. He raised his voice, ensuring the entire diner could hear. "Looks like we've got another deadbeat trying to eat for free. Hey, you think this is a charity? Either you pay up right now or I'm calling the precinct. I don't care how polite you look, a thief is a thief." The man in the gray shirt didn't flinch. He looked up at Silas with a visible surprise that quickly melted into a curious, intelligent scrutiny. He checked his wallet again, his lips parted slightly, as if he genuinely couldn't understand the failure of the plastic in his hand. The shame of the room's collective gaze began to settle over the table, thick and suffocating. Nancy looked at the man's hands. They were still, not trembling with the guilt of a con artist, but resting with the dignity of someone who had simply reached an unexpected end. She looked at Silas, whose hand was already hovering over the wall-mounted phone, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Wait, Silas," Nancy said, her voice trembling but firm. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, neatly folded stack of cash, the tip she had earned from the grueling breakfast shift. "The card is fine. I forgot I owed this gentleman change from earlier this morning. The meal is covered." She didn't look at Silas's baffled rage. She walked to the table and carefully laid the cash down, her eyes lowered respectfully. She wasn't just paying a debt, she was protecting a man's pride from a world that wanted to tear it down. The heavy silence that followed Nancy's intervention was broken only by the rhythmic, dying buzz of the neon sign overhead. Silas stared at the crumpled bills on the table, his face a mask of thwarted malice. He looked as though he wanted to argue, to peel back the lie Nancy had just woven, but with the payment physically resting on the wood, his leverage had evaporated. With a final, guttural huff, he snatched the money and retreated toward the kitchen, his retreating footsteps sounding like a drumbeat of resentment against the worn linoleum. Nancy felt the man's eyes on her, not with the predatory sharpness of the other patrons, but with a weight that felt like an evaluation. She kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the task of clearing a nearby tray to hide the slight tremor in her hands. That $10 had been her lifeline, the fare for the late-night bus that kept her from walking through the darkened, dangerous streets of the district, and the small reserve she had set aside for her brother's textbook. By giving it up, she hadn't just paid for a stranger's stew, she had traded her own safety for his dignity. "You should not have done that," the man said quietly. His voice was low, carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the cheap wooden table. Nancy paused, finally looking up. She offered him a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but held a steady warmth. "In this place, sir, pride is the only thing they can't charge you for. I wasn't going to let him take yours." Cong Luyen sat back, his sharp jawline tightening as he processed her words. He looked at the slender woman in the faded apron, seeing the physical toll of her double shifts in the slight dip of her shoulders, yet recognizing a strength that the sharks of his own world could never comprehend. He reached for a small white paper bag on the counter, a pastry Nancy had tucked there earlier, intending it for her own meager dinner. "Keep it," she whispered as she saw him reach for it. "You have a long walk ahead, I imagine." Cong stood up, his composed posture suddenly making him seem much taller than he had appeared while seated. He didn't offer a profusion of thanks. Instead, he gave her a singular, slow nod that felt like a silent pact. As he turned to leave, he paused by the door, his silhouette framed by the harsh, judging light of the street. He watched as Nancy immediately returned to work, scrubbing a spill with a grace that turned the menial labor into an act of defiance. He stepped out into the humid night, the packaged pastry heavy in his hand. He didn't look like a man who had just been saved by a waitress. He looked like a king who had just found a diamond in a mountain of coal. Behind him, inside the Golden Grill, Nancy watched the bus roar past the window without stopping, knowing she was now facing a 4-mile walk in the dark. She simply adjusted her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair back into her bun, and headed toward table 6. She had chosen dignity over survival, unaware that the man in the gray shirt was already beginning to rewrite the rules of her world. The following morning, the Golden Grill felt less like a diner and more like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the smell of scorched ham and the sharp chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. Silas Vance was waiting by the time clock, his arms folded across his chest like a prison warden.
He didn't say a word as Nancy clocked in, but his eyes, small and glinting with a petty, focused heat, followed her every move. He had spent the night stewing over the $10 she had laid on that table, viewing her act of mercy as a personal insurrection. "You think you're a philanthropist, Walker?" Silas's voice rasped in her ear as she reached for her station's coffee pots. "You think you've got enough extra cash to play hero for every deadbeat that wanders in off the docks? If you're that flush with resources, you clearly aren't working hard enough." He slapped a heavy yellowed bucket at her feet. It was filled with a caustic mixture of bleach and lye. "The night shift forgot to deep clean the walk-in freezer and the grease traps. Since you were so concerned with the comfort of our guests, you can handle those before the lunch rush. And don't think you're skipping your tables. You'll work the floor and the grime simultaneously." The workload was a physical assault. Nancy's day became a blurred cycle of kneeling on the freezing metal floor of the walk-in to scrub ice-crusted blood and vegetable scraps, only to stand and rush to a booth to serve steaming plates of eggs with a steady hand. Every time she paused to catch her breath, Silas was there, looming like a shadow over her shoulder, finding a new smudge on a glass or a missed crumb on a chair. By noon, the invisible ache in her joints had sharpened into a throbbing scream. Her uniform was damp from the freezer's condensation and stained with the gray sludge of the grease traps. Yet, as the dining room filled with the usual roar of disgruntled customers, Nancy didn't break. She moved with a quiet, stubborn grace, her hair still tucked into its professional bun, her eyes lowered and respectful, even as Silas barked orders that were meant to humiliate her in front of the regulars. She understood the game he was playing. He wanted her to quit. He wanted to see her pride crumble so he could feel the weight of his own small power. But as she hauled a heavy crate of potatoes toward the kitchen, her mind drifted back to the man in the gray shirt. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not as a servant, but as a person of substance. That memory was a cold glass of water in the desert of Silas's cruelty. She wasn't just a waitress surviving a shift. She was a woman guarding a secret dignity that Silas Vance could never reach, no matter how much work he piled onto his shoulders. She would endure the shadow, unaware that the man she had protected was currently watching the diner from the back of a black sedan, noting every time Silas raised his voice. The lunch rush had begun to plateau into a simmer when the bell above the door chimed, a lonely sound against the backdrop of sizzling fat. Cong Luyen returned, his presence as unassuming as a shadow. He wore the same neutral gray shirt, his expression a mask of placid observation, and chose the same booth in the corner. Nancy felt a strange surge of relief at the sight of him. She moved toward his table, her gait slightly stiff from the morning's scrubbing, but her face remained a harbor of calm. She didn't mention the debt or the bus ride she had missed. She simply set a bowl of beef stew before him. It was lukewarm. The kitchen staff had been neglecting the burners, but she had added an extra slice of crusty bread hidden beneath the napkin. "It's a bit cold today," she murmured, her eyes meeting his with a silent apology. "The kitchen is distracted." Cong didn't look at the soup. His sharp eyes were fixed on Nancy's hands, noting the red, raw skin around her knuckles, the unmistakable signature of lye and bleach. "You have been busy," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "There is always work for those who don't mind the dirt," Nancy replied, adjusting her apron. As Cong ate, he watched the snakes of the diner. He saw Silas Vance leaning over the counter, whispering a crude joke to a regular while gesturing toward Nancy's back. He saw the way the younger servers avoided her eyes, fearful that her bad luck might rub off on their tips. The air in the Golden Grill was thick with the petty politics of survival, a microcosm of the cold hierarchies Cong ruled in the shipping yards. "Why stay?" Cong asked, suddenly, his spoon resting against the ceramic. "This place does not deserve your grace." Nancy paused, her hand resting on the back of the opposite chair.
She looked out the window at the crumbling brickwork of the waterfront district, where a group of elderly men were sharing a single newspaper, and a mother was carefully dividing a sandwich between two children. The diner isn't just Silas, sir. It's the heart of this block. If I leave, and the others like me leave, there's no one left to keep the lights on for people who have nowhere else to go. Strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room, sir. It's about being the one who's still standing when the noise stops. Cong Luyen looked at her, and for the first time the curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a profound, dangerous respect. He saw the neighborhood through her words, not as a slum to be exploited, but as a fortress of quiet resilience. He realized then that Nancy Walker wasn't just a waitress, she was the soul of the waterfront. As he watched her walk away to defend the busboy from Silas's latest outburst, Cong reached into his pocket and touched an encrypted satellite phone. The test was nearing an end, and the snakes in the grass had no idea that the lion was already among them, moved by the cold soup and the sharp wisdom of a woman they had tried to break. The atmosphere outside the Golden Grill had shifted from the usual hum of industry to a jagged, predatory silence. For days, black SUVs with tinted windows had been circling the block like sharks in shallow water. They were the Iron Vultures, a rival syndicate known for dismantling neighborhoods to build high-rise concrete tombs. Inside the diner, the air was thick with a new kind of fear. Nancy noticed the change in the way the regulars held their mugs, tightly, as if they expected them to be snatched away. When the bell rang this time, it wasn't a customer who entered, but three men in sharp, synthetic suits that looked like armor. They didn't sit. They marched straight to the counter, where Silas was frantically polishing a glass. "The offer is final, Vance," the leader sneered, his voice loud enough to carry over the sizzle of the grill. "We buy the deed, the block goes down, and you get a nice payout to retire. If you refuse, well, fires are very common in old buildings with bad wiring." Silas, usually the tyrant, looked suddenly small, his face a pale shade of gray. He looked around the room, his eyes darting to Nancy, then to the floor. He was a man who understood power only when he was the one wielding it. Faced with real force, he was ready to sell the soul of the neighborhood for a check. Nancy stood at the end of the counter, her hands gripping the edge of a serving tray. She looked at the elderly men in the corner booths, the ones who had spent 40 years coming here for their morning coffee, and the young families who relied on the diner's affordable meals. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of righteous fury. "You can't just take it," Nancy said, her voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the leader's threats. The man in the suit turned, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "And who are you? The help? I'm the one who knows everyone on this block. I'm the one who knows that if you tear this place down, you're tearing down the only home some of these people have. You see a deed, I see a community." The leader laughed, a cold, metallic sound, and stepped toward her. But before he could speak, a quiet voice rose from the corner booth. "She is right. You see only the surface." Cong Luyen sat with his back to the room, his gray shirt stark against the dark wood of the booth. He hadn't looked up from his tea, yet the three men in suits froze. There was something in the frequency of his voice, a low-grade threat more terrifying than mere overt violence. Nancy watched as the man she had fed and protected finally looked up. His eyes weren't those of a deadbeat anymore. They were the eyes of a judge. He looked at the thugs, then turned his gaze to Nancy, a small, knowing nod passing between them. For the first time, Nancy realized that while everyone else had been shouting, her poor customer was the only one truly listening to the heartbeat of the waterfront, and he was clearly not finished with his meal.
The tension in the Golden Grill snapped like a dry bone. The leader of the Iron Vultures didn't wait for a rebuttal. He reached into the breast of his jacket, his face contorting into a mask of professional malice. But before he could draw his weapon, the front window of the diner shattered in a violent spray of glass. A black motorcycle roared past on the sidewalk, a spray of high-caliber bullets stitching a path of destruction through the air, aimed directly at the corner booth where Cong Luyen sat. Time seemed to liquefy. While Silas dived behind the cash register with a pathetic yelp, Nancy didn't think about her bus fare, her mounting debts, or the frayed edges of her uniform. She saw only the man who had sat in her corner for days, the man who had listened when no one else would. With a guttural cry of warning, she lunged across the narrow aisle. Her slender, elegant frame moved with a sudden, desperate strength, her hands catching Cong by the shoulders and dragging him downward. They hit the floor as a second volley of gunfire shredded the wooden table above them, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Nancy didn't let go. She used her momentum to pull him behind the heavy stainless steel counter of the service station, the only piece of furniture in the diner solid enough to stop a bullet. She shielded his body with her own, her deep brown skin pressed against his gray shirt, her breath hitching in her chest as the world outside descended into chaos. "Stay down," she hissed, her eyes wide and fierce. She could feel the heat of the grill behind her and the cold vibration of the floorboards beneath her knees. Cong Luyen didn't struggle. He lay perfectly still beneath her protection, his sharp jawline inches from her face. In the midst of the carnage, his expression remained unnervingly calm, his eyes locked onto hers with a piercing intensity. He wasn't looking at the shattered glass or the fleeing thugs. He was looking at the woman who was currently acting as his human shield. The iron vultures scrambled for the exit, caught between the drive-by shooters and the sudden thunderous arrival of 3 black SUVs that screeched to a halt outside. Men in tactical gear swarmed the diner, but they weren't wearing the vultures' colors. They moved with the surgical precision of an army. Nancy felt Cong's hand come up to rest on her arm, not to push her away, but to steady her. The humble customer sat up slowly as the gunfire ceased, the air thick with the smell of cordite and burnt coffee. He looked at Nancy, whose professional bun had finally come undone, her hair falling in dark waves around her face. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading to leave behind a raw, naked courage. "You saved me," Cong whispered, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "I told you," Nancy panted, her eyes searching the wreckage of her diner. "We look out for our own." Cong stood up, stepping out from behind the steel shield. As he did, the tactical team burst through the door, immediately dropping to their knees in a circle around the booth. "Master Luyen," they shouted in unison, their heads bowed. Nancy remained on the floor, her hands stained with the grime of the grease trap she had scrubbed that morning, realizing with a jolting heart that the man she had just protected didn't need a shield. He owned the war.
The chaos of the gunfire was replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had solidified. The men in tactical gear didn't just stand guard, they transformed the ruined diner into a fortress in a matter of seconds. The iron vultures who hadn't fled were pinned against the shattered windows, their bravado replaced by the whimpering terror of small animals caught in a snare. Cong stood in the center of the wreckage, his gray shirt dusted with plaster and glass, yet he looked more commanding than any man Nancy had ever seen in a tailored suit. He reached out a hand to Nancy, his fingers steady and warm. As he helped her rise from the floor, the lead operative, a man with a jagged scar and eyes like flint, approached and dropped to one knee on the grime-streaked linoleum. "The perimeter is secure, Chairman Luyen," the operative barked, his voice echoing off the scorched tiles. "The Iron Vulture's assets are being frozen as we speak. We await your command regarding the property." Nancy felt the world tilt. Chairman. The word felt heavy, dangerous, and entirely out of place in a diner that smelled of burnt coffee. She looked at Cong, searching for the poor customer who had needed her $10 mercy. He was still there, but the mask of the humble wanderer had been discarded, revealing a king who had been walking among his subjects in secret. Silas Vance crawled out from behind the cash register, his face a sickly shade of yellow. He began to stammer, his eyes darting between the armed men and the man he had called a deadbeat just days before. I didn't know. Mr. Luyen, sir, if I had known who you were, I never would have— That is precisely the point, Silas, Cong interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying velvet. He didn't look at Silas, he looked at the cracked ceiling, then at Nancy. You only show respect to power you can see. You treat the vulnerable like trash because you think they have no teeth. But you forgot that the ground you stand on belongs to the Han-Luyen Shipping Syndicate. Cong turned his gaze to Silas, and the manager visibly flinched. I bought the deed to this block 3 hours ago, not to tear it down, as your friends in the synthetic suits intended, but to preserve it. Which means, Silas, that I am now your landlord, and as of this moment, your lease on this life and this building is terminated. Cong leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. Get out. If I see you in this district by sunset, I will treat you with the same charity you showed me. Silas didn't wait. He scrambled for the back exit, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to vanish. Nancy watched him go, feeling a strange sense of lightness. She looked at the man beside her, the lion who had finally revealed himself. Cong didn't look at the fleeing coward. He looked at Nancy's hands, which were still trembling, and for the first time, his sharp features softened into a look of profound, unshakable gratitude. The test was over, and the humble man was about to show the world what happens when a king owes a debt of honor to a waitress. The aftermath of the attack didn't result in a police siren's wail or a chaotic investigation. It resulted in a clinical, terrifyingly efficient purging. Cong Luyen did not leave the ruined diner. Instead, he reclaimed his corner booth, the table now a makeshift war room, and pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from the bag of an aide. He looked at Nancy, who was still wearing her stained apron, standing amidst the wreckage of her workplace. You told me once that you see everything on this block, Nancy, Cong said, his voice returning to that low, resonant calm. You spoke of the snakes and the vultures. I want their names. Not just the ones who pulled the triggers, but the ones who signed the papers to starve this neighborhood. Nancy realized then that her invisible status had been her greatest weapon. For years, she had served coffee to the corrupt city councilors who whispered about kickbacks in the back booths. She had mopped floors while the Iron Vultures lieutenants bragged about which storefronts they would torch next. She had kept a mental ledger of every slight, every bribe, and every act of cruelty that had slowly bled the waterfront dry. One by one, Nancy gave him the receipts of her life. She named the precinct captain who took envelopes behind the diner's dumpster. She identified the building inspector who had been paid to overlook the Iron Vulture's arson threats. As she spoke, Cong's fingers moved across the screen with a predatory rhythm. With a single tap, the world outside began to shift. In the high-rise offices across the river, bank accounts belonging to the Iron Vultures were suddenly emptied. Foreclosure notices were digitally served to the shell companies holding the neighborhood's debt. In the local precinct, the captain's private phone rang with a message that stripped him of his pension and his protection in the span of a heartbeat. Cong wasn't just fighting a war, he was deleting his enemies from the city's ledger. They think they are the hunters, Cong murmured, watching a live feed of the Iron Vulture's headquarters being swarmed by his own private security. But they forgot that a city is built on its people, not its shadows. Nancy watched the destruction of her oppressors from behind the counter. It wasn't the violent revenge she might have once imagined, but something far more permanent. It was the systematic dismantling of a corrupt machine by the only man powerful enough to break it, fueled by the memory of a $10 meal. She saw the fear in the eyes of the remaining Iron Vultures as they realized their empire was vanishing into the digital ether. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the district was no longer a hunting ground. The Vultures were gone, And for the first time in years, Nancy felt the air in the Golden Grill lose its oily weight of dread. The silence was no longer heavy, it was clean. 6 months later, the morning sun did not judge the waterfront. It bathed the district in a warm, amber glow that reflected off the glass of the newly renovated community center. Where the Golden Grill once stood as a monument to grime and exhaustion, a sleek, modern hub now hummed with a different kind of energy. The neon sign no longer stuttered in a dying buzz. It stood steady and bright, a beacon for the neighborhood that had refused to break. Nancy Walker stepped out of a black sedan, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with a rhythm of purpose. She had traded the faded black dress and the stained white apron for a tailored charcoal gray power suit that complemented the deep, smooth mahogany of her skin. Her hair was still pulled back into a neat, professional bun, but the weary dip in her shoulders had been replaced by a graceful, commanding posture. She carried a leather briefcase instead of a serving tray, yet her eyes retained the same quiet, deep intelligence that had once seen the humanity in a deadbeat customer. As she entered the lobby, she wasn't met with the bark of a manager or the demands of a harried crowd. Instead, the staff, local residents she had personally hired, greeted her with nods of genuine respect. Nancy was no longer a ghost in a white collar. She was the director of the Luyen Foundation, the woman who held the keys to the district's future. Cong Luyen was waiting for her in the sun-drenched office overlooking the docks. He was dressed in a bespoke suit that finally matched the hidden authority he had always carried, but he was standing by a small table in the corner, pouring 2 cups of black tea. "The reports from the new vocational school are in," Nancy said, her voice steady and clear. "Enrollment is up 30%. The invisible workers of this city are finally finding their voices." Cong looked at her, his sharp features softening as he handed her a cup. "They found their voices because you gave them a seat at the table, Nancy. You taught me that an empire is only as strong as the person who mopped its floors." Nancy walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the skyline where her brother was currently attending his first university lecture. She thought back to the $10 bill she had laid on a scarred wooden table, a sacrifice that had felt like the end of the world at the time. It had been the smallest act of mercy, a ripple in a vast, cold ocean. But that ripple had become a tidal wave that had washed away the snakes and the vultures, leaving behind a foundation built on dignity. "Lunch?" Cong asked, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Nancy laughed, the sound ringing bright and full in the quiet room. She leaned against the window, the director and the Mafia boss side by side, ruling the waterfront with the same compassion that had once saved a stranger in the dark. The waitress had become the queen, and the city was finally listening.
This view is incredible, isn't it?
It really is, and this tea is perfect.
I'm glad.